Chapter 1. My Destiny is Fulfilled. June 4th, 1944, was the worst day of my life. My crewmates and I were being held captive in a steel cage on an American aircraft carrier. Searing heat from the ship's engines turned the already stifling tropical air in the cage into a virtual blast furnace. Worst of all, far worst of all, we could see our proud boat, the German submarine U-505, being towed behind us like some wounded gray wolf being dragged into captivity. Despite my best attempt to scuttle her, she had fallen into American hands intact. The first enemy vessel captured on the high seas by the United States Navy since the War of 1812. 55 years later, however, the shock and shame of that day has mellowed to a nostalgic pride in our lucky old boat. Today, U-505 can be seen high and dry on display at Chicago's Museum of Science and Industry. According to its commemorative plaque, the submarine stands as a monument to the sacrifice of American seamen during World War II. But for us crewmen of U-505, the boat also symbolizes the hardships and sacrifices that we endured for 2 years of bloody warfare against overwhelming odds. The saga of our boat's wartime adventures is big enough to accommodate both interpretations. Over the years, I have organized several reunions of the American and German veterans involved in her capture. Today, the hatreds and misunderstandings that once separated our peoples have vanished. We veterans embrace each other, much as our nations have, focusing on our similarities rather than our differences. We now understand that during the war, whether we were hunting or being hunted, we were all just young boys doing what we saw as our patriotic duty. The only arguing now is over who will pay for the next round of drinks. This book has been written to tell the full and true story of our life aboard U-505 as I experienced it firsthand. I have withheld or exaggerated nothing. My only concession has been to conceal a few names of some of our crew members in deference to the feelings of their families. My hope is that by explaining what life was like aboard a front-line U-boat during World War II, a fuller and more balanced understanding of military history and human behavior will result. The final judgment of our nation and of ourselves must be left to future generations. My decision as a young man to join the German Navy rather than the Luftwaffe or Panzers was totally my choice, but there was never any doubt that when the time came I would enlist to defend my country in one service or another. After all, I came from a family with a proud military tradition. I was born Hans Jakob Göbeler on November 9, 1923, in the little Hessian farming village of Bottendorf near Marburg. As a young boy, I spent many an hour on the knee of my grandfather, Matthias, who had fought in that most splendid of German conflicts, the Franco-Prussian War. His service in that war, which culminated in the capture of the capital of our ancient enemy, the French, instilled in my young mind visions of the heroic glories of combat. The dark, inhumane side of war I learned from my father Heinrich's experience in the First World War. Father enlisted in the German army at the age of 18. He fought on the Eastern Front, where he participated in the great early battles of maneuver against the Russians. On November 20th, 1914, he was captured and spent the next several years in terrifying conditions of captivity in the Katskoye slave labor camp in Siberia. Of the 20,000 men in his group captured by the Russians, 18,000 died that first year from exhaustion and malnutrition. It was only through the intervention of a famous Swedish nurse that the International Red Cross found out about the labor camp and caused conditions to improve. Once the war ended, the surviving camp inmates were caught up in the Bolshevik Revolution. Over the course of the next 3 years, my father and his comrades slowly fought their way westward, sometimes skirmishing with both Red and White armies on the same day. During their trek, my father witnessed unspeakable atrocities committed by the Communists on the Russian people. A steely determination grew in his soul to never allow the scourge of communism to take hold in our homeland. In November 1921, a full 7 years after his capture, my father finally arrived home. To his horror, he discovered that the infection of communism had indeed spread to Germany. Revolutionary councils had been set up in many cities, and the political system from top to bottom was in total chaos. The Reds were especially strong in the trade unions. My father had resumed his old civilian job as a local official in the railroads, but eventually his honorable service in the military and his refusal to swear allegiance to the Communist Party resulted in him being fired. Blacklisted by the Red unions, my father spent 5 agonizing years trying to find steady work to support our family. The situation worsened when the national economy collapsed. Listeners should remember that the Great Depression began in Germany and had its severest effects there. Money became worthless and famine was rampant. I have many haunting memories of the hunger and poverty my family endured during this period. Riots and revolution were everywhere. German society, once the most prosperous and cultured in all of Europe, was disintegrating. It was at this time a politician appeared who promised to solve our nation's problems, give food and work to the unemployed, regain our lost territory, reestablish safety in the streets, and restore dignity and honor to our people. We would have voted for such a man if his name were Schmidt or Meyer. His name just happened to be Hitler. Whatever else may be said about the National Socialists, no one can say they didn't fulfill their early promises to the German people. Despite the qualms many people had about the Nazis, all doubts were quickly swept away by the flood of reforms and improvements they brought to our nation. Today, many people say we Germans made a Faustian deal with the devil, but at the time it seemed the only way out of a national nightmare. No one regretted the passing of our short, ineffectual experiment with democracy, the Weimar Republic. For my family, the election of Hitler as chancellor had very concrete benefits. The communists were thrown out of the railroad unions, and my father was rehired as an official in the new Reichsbahn national rail system. As for me, I joined the Hitler Youth movement. I was an enthusiastic member, becoming for a short time the youngest Deutsches Jungvolk leader in the country. I still have my DJ leader's identity book and a photo of me and my much older and taller troop members as mementos. The Hitler Youth's emphasis on patriotism, loyalty, and sacrifice fit in perfectly with the values my father instilled in me. Little did we suspect that these same qualities would compel our nation to follow Hitler over the precipice to disaster. Meanwhile, I did well in school. When not studying for exams, I immersed myself in reading military histories of the First World War. The exploits of our submarines, the U-boats, especially fascinated me. In my view, victory over the British Empire could only be won at sea. Since Germany could never challenge the British fleet directly, our submarines would have to be the key to victory. As the international situation worsened in the late 30s, my thoughts were increasingly preoccupied with joining the military. War seemed imminent in the summer of 1939, so I attempted to join the Navy. To my horror and my mother's immeasurable relief, I was rejected on grounds that I was only 15 years old and because of a mistaken diagnosis of color blindness. A quick examination by our family doctor dispelled the mistaken diagnosis regarding my vision, but still the recruiters would not have me. Complete your schooling, they advised me, and learn a trade that will make you valuable to the Kriegsmarine. Then perhaps we will consider you. A few weeks later, war broke out in Europe. Rather than continue with higher education by entering the gymnasium, I chose to follow the recruiter's advice and learn a technical trade that I knew would make me of value to the Navy. I attacked my studies with a vengeance. I was absolutely determined to get into the war before it was over. Due to my obsessive efforts and the war emergency, I was able to complete the Master Motor Mechanics course in only 2 years, half the normal time. I also earned a driver's license, which back in those days was a very rare thing for a teenager to have. The only remnant of non-technical subjects I allowed in my life was my interest in learning English. Learning to speak the language of our enemy was seen as mildly unpatriotic, so I quietly studied an English textbook in my spare time. In August of 1941, at the ripe age of 17, I reapplied for enlistment in the Kriegsmarine. This time I was immediately accepted. Naturally, my departure from home was an emotional affair. My mother, Elizabeth, and 2 sisters, Anna Marie and Katie, were especially distraught. My mother gave me a small black Bible to read and reminded me to be a good boy and say my prayers every day. My father did his best to retain his composure, but the mix of pride and concern in his glistening eyes was unmistakable. My naval basic training took place at the big Luitpold barracks in Beverlo, occupied Belgium. To my infinite disappointment, we were issued green uniforms, steel helmets, and Mauser rifles, just like ordinary army soldiers. Indeed, our training was identical to the Wehrmacht's basic infantry training. They chased us like dogs at that camp. The only skill I learned was how to crawl like a snake on my belly through the mud. I was quite a bit smaller than most of the recruits, but I wouldn't let that stop me from passing all the tests. After 3.5 months of grueling training, we were physically tough and mentally conditioned to instantly obey any order. Unbeknownst to us, each one of us had been very carefully watched and evaluated by recruiters from the U-boat service. Looking back on the recruiters' decision, I suppose they were impressed by my enthusiasm, not to mention the fact that the cramped conditions inside a sub was one place where my small size would be an advantage. At any rate, at the end of the training, my name appeared on a list of those graduates being offered a chance to go to submarine school. Naturally, I jumped at the chance to join this elite service. Only 10% of naval recruits were offered this honor. My next destination was the main naval base at Wilhelmshaven on the North Sea. I was proud as a peacock as I boarded the train back to Germany. I was especially satisfied to be wearing the sharp-looking blue dress uniform of a sailor instead of the rough woolen tunic of a foot soldier. My orders and travel pass listed a false destination in order to camouflage the fact that I was headed to U-boat training. Once in Wilhelmshaven, we underwent an extensive series of medical exams and written tests, which I passed without any problem. After 1 month, I left for basic submarine physical training at a base in Neustadt on the Baltic Sea. We spent 3 torturous weeks in various pressurized chambers and deep diving tanks. The main point of this training was to accustom us to the pressure changes inside a submarine, and to teach us how to escape from a sinking boat using artificial lungs. After it was all over, a group of about 80 or 90 of us were ordered to the Erste U-Boot-Schule submarine school at Pillau in East Prussia for advanced technical training. If any of us thought the hardest part of submarine training was over, we were sadly mistaken. It seemed as if the school instructors at Pillau were deliberately trying to make as many of us wash out as possible. And it worked. For one thing, the physical conditioning became ever more brutal. Every day, despite knee-deep snow, we were forced to march several kilometers dressed in nothing more than a pair of sports shorts. Morning calisthenics were performed under the same conditions. After a couple minutes, our arms and legs became numb from the cold, but there was never any question of complaining. We also went on long forced marches designed to improve our endurance. The worst torture was running up and down sand dunes on the coast while wearing our gas masks. The slightest bit of slacking or complaining resulted in even more of the same. Some of the physical training contained obvious psychological components. For instance, we were ordered to jump over walls, not knowing what was on the other side, and to jump off platforms, not knowing how high they were or what awaited us at the bottom of our fall. Trainees who couldn't bring themselves to jump were given one more chance. Those who hesitated a second time were immediately expelled from the U-Boot-Schule. We were also given boxing gloves and purposely matched with opponents who would challenge our courage. My opponents were always taller than me, sometimes over a foot taller, but I always stood my ground and tried to give as good as I got. Through it all, I forced myself to never hesitate at performing these tests, because we knew that every little reaction of ours was being very carefully recorded. When they weren't toughening us up, they were teaching us new technical skills. I was a little disappointed when they assigned me to study electric motors instead of the diesel engines that were already my specialty. I soon learned that the U-boat service expected us to have multiple skills so that we could take over the duties of other crewmen who might be injured while at sea. Inside the classroom, the instructors demanded the same unhesitating performance that they did on the athletic field. If asked a question, we shot up out of our seat and snapped to attention, automatically shouting out the full answer without a moment's delay. In the end, only about 9 or 10 out of every 100 candidates graduated from the school. The ones who did not pass were assigned to other parts of the Navy. When I received word that I had successfully graduated, I was ecstatic. It was the proudest day in my life. The top-ranked graduates were assigned directly to a front-line U-boat crew. The graduates who had performed less well were sent to shipyards to witness the final construction of their submarine. In this way, they would get reinforced in their familiarization with the structure and functions of their future boat. Once again, I was gratified to learn that I had done very well. The sleeve insignia on my uniform now designated me as a Maschinengefreiter, machinist, second class. After a short furlough home, I was given orders to report for active duty to the 2nd U-boat flotilla, located in Lauria, France. I was floating on wings of joy as the train rumbled its way to Lorient. For a long time I stared at my reflection in the window, my familiar face in the unfamiliar uniform forming a transparent ghostly image flying past the French countryside. It was as if powerful winds of fate had swept me up and were guiding me to the very eye of the great storm of events engulfing the world. Our U-boats were littering the ocean bottom with the hulks of dozens of enemy vessels every month, and I was actually going to participate in the glory. I was sure that it would be just like the heroic war stories I had read in my history books. Excitement and pride filled my soul as the train brought me closer to what I felt was my destiny. I tried hard to see some remnants of battle from our amazing victory over the Anglo-French armies the previous year, but I only managed to glimpse one or two rusty enemy tanks knocked out during the fighting. For the most part, there were very few outward hints of last year's campaign, except in the train stations, where one saw clusters of signs in German pointing the way to various military installations in the area. There was little to indicate that France had ever fought, much less lost, a major war. After 18 hours of exhausting travel, I finally arrived in Lauria. This picturesque seaport on Brittany's Atlantic coast was the site of the first German U-boat base built to take advantage of our conquest of France. Compared to our old Baltic and North Sea bases, Lauria would allow our boats to sail directly into the Atlantic without hazarding the long and dangerous trip around the British Isles. Giant concrete bunkers had been built in the harbor to protect our boats from air attack. Similar U-boat sally bases were constructed in Brest, La Rochelle, Saint-Nazaire, and Bordeaux. I spent my first few days in Lorient dealing with the hundreds of annoying little administrative details required by the military bureaucracy to fight a war. After what seemed an eternity, I was finally given a boat assignment, U-105. She was a veteran old warhorse under the command of Capitaine Lieutenant, Navy Lieutenant George Shua. I had barely settled in, however, when I was notified that I was being transferred to a new boat, U-505. That afternoon I walked over to the bomb-proof slip where U-505 was being berthed. I could tell by her condition that she was fresh out of the shipyards, with a light gray factory paint job with dark gray trim typical of those early war years. A handsome insignia featuring a rampaging lion wielding an axe graced the conning tower. A dock worker told me the emblem signified the skipper of the boat, whose name meant lion in German. She was a beautiful boat. If U-505 had been a woman, you could have called it love at first sight. Unlike the medium-sized Type 7 boats which formed the majority of Germany's submarine fleet during the war, U-505 was one of the larger Type 9 boats, designed to operate independently on long-range patrols on the periphery of the Atlantic. The bigger displacement was utilized to carry more fuel and torpedoes, making it superior in range and armament to its smaller cousin. Unfortunately, the Type 9's significantly longer length and heavier weight made it less maneuverable and slower to dive than the medium boats, characteristics which made the Type 9 especially vulnerable to surprise attack from the air. They were also 3 times as expensive to build as the Type 7s. Because of these factors, the Type 9s never comprised more than 25% of Germany's wartime submarine fleet. U-505's keel had been laid on June 12, 1940, at the Deutsche Werft submarine yards in Hamburg. She was one of the first of the Model C subtypes built, a 1,232-ton version incorporating the latest improvements based on wartime experience. She was 252 feet in length and 15.25 feet wide at her middle section. The height between her keel and the tip of her periscope was 44.5 feet, giving her a periscope depth of 14 meters in the European method of calculation. Reflecting the almost leisurely pace of German industrial production in the early war years, it took well over a year before her construction was complete. The layout of U-505 was typical of submarines of that era. Starting at the bow, the first main compartment was the forward torpedo room. The 4 torpedo launching tubes located here formed our boat's main anti-shipping armament. Aside from the 4 torpedoes loaded in the tubes, there were 4 additional torpedoes stowed here as reloads. When not in combat, the room doubled as the forward crew quarters. There were not enough bunks for everyone in the crew, so someone slept in your bed while you were on duty. The bunks folded up out of the way whenever we needed to fire or reload torpedoes. Moving back from the forward torpedo room, you passed through a heavy waterproof hatch into the petty officers' quarters. Their quarters were just as crowded as ours, but at least they didn't have to share their bunks with anyone. Just beyond the petty officers' bunks was the tiny galley where meals were prepared. Food was heated by 3 hot plates and 2 small ovens, all powered with electricity. There was also a small refrigerator and food locker there. Since the galley was so small, fresh food had to be stored throughout the boat. Only as a war patrol progressed and we consumed the food did we have even the slightest bit of free space on board. However, no matter how much fresh food we tried to cram aboard before a departure, usually about 4 tons, we always suffered from symptoms of an unhealthy diet by the time we returned. The next compartments were the officers' wardroom and the radio underwater sounding station. To add a bit of opulence to the officers' accommodations, the bulkheads of the wardroom were decorated with oak veneer paneling. When not being slept in, the lower bunks could be folded up in order to form a sort of conference room or recreation area. Their quarters also featured the luxury of their own wash basin. Unfortunately, since our boat's water distillation unit only produced about 64 gallons of fresh water each day, there was only enough water for cooking, drinking, and replacement water for the batteries. That left the officers' prized wash basin largely a symbolic amenity. The radio underwater sounding station was also popular as an entertainment area, especially when the technicians tuned in a favorite radio broadcast or played records on the gramophone. Opposite from the radio station was the captain's quarters. Like the officers' quarters, this tiny room was paneled in oak and featured its own wash basin. When not in use, a folding top covered the wash basin, transforming it into a small writing desk. The next compartment, located amidships directly beneath the conning tower, was the control room. This was the operational heart of a U-boat. Hundreds of levers, valves, cranks, gauges, and wheels covered virtually every inch of the compartment. My first duty station as a control room mate was at the forward end of the room, controlling the hydraulic lift for the periscope. During an attack, the skipper operated the periscope from the conning tower above us. After a while, I was moved to the forward port corner of the control room. There I took on much more responsibility, handling the approximately 36 hand wheels that controlled the opening and closing of various diving and trim tank valves. Beyond the control room, through another watertight hatch, was the diesel engine room. The 2 huge engines, which we nicknamed the Jumbos, were 9-cylinder MAN diesels capable of producing 2,200 horsepower each. With a standard load of 208 tons of diesel fuel, they gave us a range of approximately 13,000 nautical miles. Top speed with the diesels was just a little over 18 knots. Of course, Since the jumbos were air breathers, they could only be operated when our boat was on the surface. Only later in the war were U-boats built with the snorkel device, which allowed our subs to run on diesels while at periscope depth. We had a lot of sympathy for the grease and soot-covered men in the diesel room, whom we nicknamed the Black Crew. The compartment was always filled with terrific noise and choking fumes whenever the jumbos were running. Even worse, if a young seaman in the control room made a mistake by closing a valve or hatch at the wrong time, the diesel would suck the air out of the compartment, creating a vacuum very painful to the diesel crew's ears. For underwater travel, we had 2 battery-powered Siemens electric motors, giving us a top cruising speed of 7 knots and a range of about 63 nautical miles. The long banks of 110-volt DC batteries located beneath the deck plates needed to be recharged after about 10 hours of operation. It took about 7 hours of running the diesels to fully recharge the batteries. Cruising on the surface for 7 hours was usually no problem early in the war, but later on, after Allied carrier task forces made their appearance, planes often prevented us from recharging our batteries. This made us unable to escape underwater and literally turned us into sitting ducks for the enemy. The electric motor room was located just aft of the diesel room. The electric motor control board, rudder controls, and air compressors were also located there. The last compartment was the aft torpedo room. There were only 2 torpedo launching tubes here, as well as 8 bunks for 16 crewmen. An auxiliary steering wheel was located at the far end of the room for use in case the normal steering controls failed. All of these compartments were enclosed within one large, cigar-shaped enclosure called the pressure hull. The walls of the pressure hull were constructed of a thick steel alloy specially designed to withstand the immense water pressure exerted against it when submerged. Our maximum depth published in the manuals was 100 meters, about 330 feet, but in an emergency we could dive to twice that depth, or more. Attached to the outside of the pressure hull were various other tanks. Some of these were diving tanks, which were flooded with seawater or pumped out with air in order to submerge or surface, respectively. Smaller trim tanks were used to more precisely control our depth. Other tanks held our supply of diesel fuel. Enclosing the entire vessel was the exterior hull, constructed of much thinner steel plate. The flat top surface of the exterior hull was called our upper deck. Wooden planks covering the upper deck gave us some measure of traction when walking around up there. At first glance, the upper deck of our boat appeared rather barren. Hidden below the wooden planks, however, were pressurized storage tubes for 10 more spare torpedoes. U-505 was originally armed with a large 105 millimeter deck gun mounted on the upper deck just forward of the conning tower. Later in the war, when surface attacks became impractical, the deck gun was removed and replaced with anti-aircraft weapons. Built on top of the upper deck, right above the control room, was the superstructure of the sub. The bulk of the superstructure was taken up by the conning tower, which functioned as the skipper's command station during battle at periscope depth. The open-topped bridge was located above the conning tower. Platforms for our various anti-aircraft weapons were located aft of the bridge. Obviously, the bridge and the anti-aircraft stations could only be manned when the boat was surfaced. Towering above everything were the periscope masts. When she was built, U-505 was a state-of-the-art weapon of war. But it's most important to remember that, technically speaking, she was only a submersible. That is, like all so-called submarines of the period, she was primarily a surface craft that had the additional ability to submerge for short periods. True submarines, designed to spend most of their time underwater, were not developed until later in the war, when our magnificent Type 21 submarine made its appearance. The next morning I reported to my new skipper, commander of U-505, Kapitän Lieutenant Axel Olaf Löwe. He was of medium height, with a head of thick, dark, unruly hair. My first impression of him was not favorable. He seemed very casual in both dress and demeanor. He addressed me in an informal, almost familiar manner, which was quite a change from the authoritarian tone of our instructors in submarine school. This was not the image of a U-boat commander that I had gotten from my adventure books. I soon found, however, that his quiet, casual demeanor was based on a firm foundation of first-rate professionalism and ability. As my future crewmates were quick to tell me, the very best officers don't need to throw their rank around, but rather lead by example. Löwe was just this sort of officer. The skipper sat me down in his little cabin and asked me about my family, my training, and my attitudes about service aboard a U-boat. Throughout our small talk I could see his quick, penetrating eyes gauging my responses. After a few minutes he got around to the point. His deep, soft voice suddenly took on a business-like tone. "Gaebler, I see from your records that they trained you in electric motors, even though you had a master's certificate in diesel engines. The Navy wanted 2-in-1. Well, I want 3-in-1. If you agree to the assignment, I will appoint you to duty in the Centrale, control room. It's complex work, and one small mistake can sink a boat, but I think you can handle it. If it doesn't work out, you can always go back to duty in the diesel room. What do you say?" I didn't even hesitate before accepting the skipper's proposal. A big smile spread over Löwe's face, signifying, I thought, that his evaluation of me had been correct. We shook hands in agreement. Then I snapped to attention, saluted, and left to stow my gear aboard my new boat. I spent the next few days settling into the routine of a front-line U-boat crewman. I was expecting some jealousy from the other crewmen because of my assignment to the control room, but I was mistaken. The skipper had already established a reputation for assigning men to do the job they fit best, rather than what the regulation book said. There were even a couple of lads in the crew who had gotten in trouble with the police. No other captain would have them on their boat, but Löwe was happy to accept them as long as they did their job well. In fact, he said, if they used the same resourcefulness in keeping our boat alive that they used to stay out of jail, so much the better. The reason there were slots to fill in the U-505 crew in the first place was because a few of the original crewmen didn't fit in during the cruise from Germany to Lauria. Our skipper was using his skill in assessing men to consciously build a crew that could operate effectively as a team. This was an important lesson we learned from Kapitän Lieutenant Löwe, that rank and decorations didn't matter a thing aboard a U-boat. What mattered was how well one performed his duties as part of a team. Over time, we learned what special strengths and weaknesses each one of us had, and organized ourselves accordingly. For instance, one of my good friends was a perfect seaman during normal conditions. I mean, he was absolutely perfect, and was a great asset to our crew. But as soon as the depth charges began exploding, he became totally useless. We all knew this, so someone automatically took over his duties when things got rough. I think it was this intimate knowledge of each other's individual capabilities that helped us survive the challenges we met later on, even under different skippers. I spent the daylight hours learning the intricacies of my control room duties. My main job would be to maintain the periscope's hydraulic pump and operate it during action. My other main duty was to pass on commands from the conning tower above us to the control room crew. I was reminded again and again that one improperly communicated order could finish us all. I soon demonstrated mastery of these duties. During our off-duty hours, I read technical manuals and traded scuttlebutt with the rest of the crew. I heard about U-505's initial shakedown cruise and her voyage from the Kiel Naval Base to Lauria. Rather than taking the shorter but much more dangerous route through the English Channel, U-505 sailed north around the British Isles, then southeast down toward Lorient. A couple of times they had encountered British destroyers en route, but the rough seas prevented either side from launching any attacks. My crewmates warned me about seasickness, that final exam for any sailor. By early February, final preparations were made for departure on our maiden war patrol. But first, a virtual mountain of supplies had to be loaded on board. The interior of our submarine looked more like a grocer's storeroom than a weapon of war by the time we were finished. I found it difficult to sleep those last few days before our sailing. While others in the crew enjoyed one last taste of Lorient's nightlife, I stayed awake in my bunk reading and rereading training manuals. I also found solace in the Bible my mother had given me. I prayed that my conduct in battle would be worthy of my family, nation, and God.